hermit and the dog wolf. It was many miles to the valley below, but it was easier to walk down the mountainside than it was to come up it. His feet were a little sore, but that was because his shoes were old, and actually they were not all that comfortable. The soles had worn very thin, so the small stones on the pathway dug and pinched his feet as he walked. Eventually, he reached the main pathway towards the forest, which was some 2 or 3 miles from the village where the princess lived. As he entered the forest, he thought he could hear the whine of a wolf, and he stopped, and he dropped to his haunches, leaning down towards his leg. He used his right arm to support himself as he listened carefully. Again he heard the whine, only this time it seemed closer than last time. There was a crashing through the undergrowth off to his right, and suddenly a huge dog wolf stood in front of him. The dog wolf was enormous, with great big blue eyes sunk into a deep set stare. They looked at each other, their eyes met, and the hermit showed no fear, and he did not move 1 centimetre of muscle. Motionlessly, he stared into the wolf's eyes and thought of how frightened this beast of the forest was, but how beautiful he was in his fear. His huge, sleek body hunched forward into a defensive stance, and the massive paws of his front legs dug several inches into the forest floor, which allowed for some idea of how heavy he must have been. His huge mouth snarled, and the great white fangs opened. His slobbering tongue spat spittle on the forest floor as the wolf shook his head from side to side. The hermit kept perfectly still. He did not even allow the sound of breath to rise from his chest. The arm that supported him was feeling a little strain from holding his body still. His muscle twitched in spasm. The dog wolf stood his ground, digging his huge paws even deeper. Around his great thick neck, the black and golden ruff was imprisoned in a heavy leather collar. And attached to the collar was a very heavy linked chain. The dog wolf must have dragged these chains of bondage for miles through the forest. And from wherever he had come, and no matter how many miles he may have travelled, these bonds of death had travelled with him. The free end of the heavy chain lay on the ground, and the hermit saw that half of the dead tree stump had caught in the link. Clearly, this had added to the weight that this beautiful animal had dragged on his escape. The dog wolf was tired and very frightened, and his beautiful coat was covered in blood from old scars that had opened and new wounds that had ripped at his strong body as he had charged through the forest. His chest was heaving with breathlessness, and his empty, lean stomach stuck to the bony rib cage which protruded through his flesh. The hermit kneeled forward until his head was below the level of the dog wolf's snarling and slobbering jowl, and drops of spittle splashed onto the hermit's face and dripped off his chin. He slowly changed his position and leaned on his hands, and the dog wolf stopped, stepped back quickly, and again dug his strong front paws into the soil under the forest undergrowth. He crouched down further, but his snarl was less aggressive, and the light in his eyes seemed somewhat different. The hermit again crouched down even more, until he practically lay on the ground in front of the dog wolf. He thought this would either result in the frightened animal attacking him, or maybe he might begin to trust the hermit. He may realize that the truth in the forest at this moment in time is that the hermit only wanted to give him love and free him from his bondage. Slowly, without hardly any movement at all, the hermit manipulated his left arm around the back and dug into his shoulder bag. He fumbled around with his blind fingers, never once taking his eyes off the dog wolf's eyes. There, he had it in his hand, a piece of cheese. He felt its shape through the wrapping. Carefully, he removed the paper that protected the cheese with blind fingers. And he broke off a small piece and carefully withdrew his hand from the bag. The dog wolf saw every single move, and though he too kept his eyes fixed on the hermit's every twitch, looking deeply into the soul of the hermit, looking for fear. But if there was any fear there at all, the dog wolf couldn't see it. He could see a man who was different from the men who he had encountered in the past. The man who had beaten him, monsters with 2 legs, had starved him almost to the point of death and chained him so tightly that he had nearly choked on many occasions. This man was different. This man was not attacking him or shouting evil words that were always followed by missiles of hate. Many times he had been too slow to get out of the way of the missiles which had been thrown at him. His beautiful body still carried the scars. The hermit placed the cheese down in front of himself, making sure that every move he made was slow and calculated. He never took his eyes from those of the dog wolf. But the frightened animal had stopped snarling and moved slowly, crouching nearer to the ground all of the time. Closer and closer he moved, inch by inch, with his nose nearly touching the piece of cheese, which lay on the ground, waiting for his starving stomach. The hungry dog wolf had no sooner scented the cheese than it was gone. It vanished in the fraction of a second that it took him to lunge forward and retire with as much speed back into a position of defense. Again, he started to snarl. This time, his voice had changed. The snarl appeared to be more of a, "I'm still not sure about you. I hate all you 2-legged creatures." The hermit slowly produced another piece of cheese, and again, laying it down in front of the hungry animal, the dog wolf lunged. And the cheese was gone. This time, the snarling stopped, and the animal stood up and straightened his fear-contorted body. He licked his chops, and again retired a few paces before he stopped and looked at the hermit with his big eyes. The hermit thought that he looked a little less fierce and felt that perhaps he might stand up. His legs and arms and the back of his neck ached from the position that he had held for almost an hour. Something told him deep inside not to move. The game with the cheese was played over and over again until there wasn't any cheese left. The dog wolf made no attempt to run away. He was waiting for what seemed to be a never-ending supply of food. Food that was not thrown down at him, that was not crawling with maggots or in decay. Food which was not accompanied by curses and words of hate. The hermit again felt deep inside his bag and found his drinking cup. As he fumbled around, he took hold of his water bottle, and together with the cup, he gently laid them on the ground. The dog wolf watched every move, and when he saw the water, his nose twitched with the thirst that was felt deep in every pore. He moved forward a little and sniffed the air. He scented the water, and when the hermit moved his hands, he stepped back again and gave a little warning snarl. The hermit looked deep into the eyes of the dog wolf, and at the same time confidently poured some of the water into the waiting cup. The animal moved quickly and had his nose inside the cup whilst the water still flowed. He began to lap at the water and slurped as quickly as his tongue would allow him to. The cup empty, he stepped back again, wagging the big bushy tail, which no longer stiff and trapped between his legs. His eyes were brighter and shone with a new calmness and trust. And the hermit produced another piece of cheese, and for a moment held it in his hand between calm, unflustered fingers. Dogwolf watched, and as the hermit put the piece of cheese between his teeth, the Dogwolf looked surprised and thought perhaps that this mouthful was not for him. The hermit leaned forward and put his head below the panting mouth. The Dogwolf watched, and as the hermit tried to stay as still as he possibly could, he made a comforting whining noise through the cheese which sat between his teeth. The beautiful creature turned his head on one side and listened as the hermit continued. Dogwolf moved slowly forward and sniffed at the cheese, and then he backed off again and stared. He stood still for a few moments, still listening to the sounds coming from this strange two-legged creature. He moved forward again, and this time took the cheese quickly from the hermit's mouth. The whole action and movement was so quick and so gentle that the hermit did not feel a thing. He was aware of moisture from the animal's mouth, which stained his lips. The hermit did it again, and so did the Dogwolf, and they did it again. This was becoming a game. By now, the hermit and the Dogwolf felt very comfortable with each other. They still looked into each other's eyes, and they still watched every move that each one made. But somehow, there was a serenity between them. The hermit gave his new friend some more water and drained a little from the bottle for himself. The last piece of cheese allowed them both to play their new game again, the game of trust. The hermit stood up and moved slowly backwards, and the Dogwolf followed him. Though he was still very shy, his confidence with the hermit had increased considerably, and his tail was wagging from side to side. His panting was now much more relaxed, and he started to sniff the bracken and moss on the ground. He sniffed a tree, left his mark for all that might come after him. The hermit gently bent down, picked up a small stone, and as he kneeled in front of his friend, he gestured a chase with the stone. The Dogwolf watched very closely. As the stone left the hermit's hand, with directed intention, it rolled along the ground, which was very interesting for the Dogwolf because every stone he'd ever encountered before had been thrown at him with hate and fear. Dogwolf broke through the undergrowth, picked up the stone, and returned it to the feet of the hermit, dropping the projectile on top of his toes. The hermit winced with slight pain, but laughed at the joy of their new game. Dogwolf wagged his tail and panted with joy. It was certainly a game that was mutually acceptable to them both. They played the game for about 10 minutes, and then they sat down under a tree. They were breathing heavily and felt quite close to each other at this point. Strange feelings. And if any onlooker had seen them together at this moment, they would have thought that they had been in each other's lives for many, many years. The hermit noticed this feeling too. As they sat under the tree, the hermit placed his hand under the animal's mouth and gently stroked the jowl with his fingers. The Dogwolf licked his fingers, and the tongue was rough, but gentle. And then he licked the back of the hermit's hand. Hermit was so pleased and happy, and he felt so much love for this animal, that the animal felt the same for him. But all of this at the moment the hermit had not realized, because he was so overcome by the contact that he was having with this beautiful animal. He gently moved his hand around the jowl and worked towards the large pointed bit to his alert ears. And rubbing and stroking gently all of the time, he took care not to frighten Dogwolf in any way. He liked it. He moved closer, and as he came closer, the hermit examined the collar that still was around Dogwolf's neck. It was heavy. It had a simple clasp, but it had bitten deeply into his flesh. Carefully stroking with one hand, he manipulated the clasp open, and the collar and chain dropped to the ground. Dogwolf leapt backwards and jumped in the air. He turned around and disappeared into the trees. Hermit watched him go. He thought, that's it. Collar's gone, chain's gone. Dogwolf has gone. It was starting to get dark, and the evening brought with it a cold chill in the air. And the hermit pulled his robe closer around his neck and covered his head with the hood. Nearly 10 minutes had passed before suddenly the undergrowth became alive as Dogwolf suddenly crashed through the bracken and leapt in front of the hermit. He bounced around and around the hermit in ever-increasing circles, whining and barking, making fun. It was getting dark, and the light of the moon could be seen shining through the canopy of the forest, casting strange shadows onto the bracken carpet below. The hermit decided that he should make camp for the night and begin to make himself a small lean-to from the bracken and the branches which were laying all around. And as he built the frame from the branches, Dogwolf kept leaping forward and stealing the branches and running away, and Hermit would grab one back and Dogwolf would take it again. A new game was starting. When the shelter was completed, Hermit crawled inside. His new friend followed him with some confidence. Dogwolf laid down next to the hermit and looked up at him with his huge eyes. Hermit had not had such a vivid dream for so many months. The journey deep in his slumbers took his astral body far into the dimensions of other worlds. He found himself in a large room with white walls. Large purple drapes decorated the walls around the window, and outside the windows he could see a lush garden of flowers and plants, and he could hear the sounds of many different animals and birds. In front of him stood a very tall man wearing a long, dark blue robe, and the cowl covered his head, but the hermit could see his face. It was a long, narrow face with a pointed chin, and the cheekbones were high. His blue eyes pierced the very soul of our hermit. The hermit had seen this spirit before, but not for a long time. It was his teacher and his guide who came to him in dreams. "It has been a long time, my son," the voice of the teacher echoed softly around the room. "You have had a hard journey, and it is time for you to take a breath, to take a break, to listen to and ponder your situation." Hermit stood transfixed in awe, and yet with a new humility that was full of light. He had no presumed conditions in his mind, only freedom. "An angel has visited you from the animal world. A four-legged creature has come to share its wisdom with you. Have you heard the teachings that he has for you? Do you know what they are?" The hermit paused for a moment before speaking and pondered the questions posed by his teacher. "I was alone and lost," said the hermit. "And so was the Dogwolf," said his teacher. "I was frightened and hungry, and I didn't know which way to turn." And at this point, tears started to flow down Hermit's cheeks. "And so was the Dogwolf," came the reply. His teacher and friend moved closer and placed his large hand on the hermit's shoulder. "Do not upset yourself, my son. There is no sadness in learning. There is only joy." The hermit stammered. "I was aggressive and unpredictable, and other creatures were frightened of me." Again, the tears were filling his eyes. His teacher closed his grip on his shoulder and gave him that feeling of warmth and security. "And the Dogwolf felt the same," he said. "I didn't know what love was anymore because my fears were so great. I had no trust, no faith, and everything that I believed in was a challenge." The hermit cried more tears. "You see," said his teacher, "there's no difference between the Dogwolf and yourself. You are one and the same." The hermit thought for a moment, but he knew what his teacher meant, and he had no problem in seeing the similarity. He knew he was right. "You gave this creature unconditioned intent and without concentration. You acted in the now. He turned to face the hermit and looked directly into his eyes. What did the dog wolf give to you, my son? The same things, the hermit said. Exactly the same things. Exactly, said his teacher. This is the lesson. When you act in the now with unconditional love and you respond to your intuition without concentration, you are truly in harmony with all that is, within all things, and at all times. The hermit bowed his head. Learn well, my son. It is important to try and live in this way at all times, and it is not easy. There is no place for ego, and ego has no place in the scheme of things. His teacher turned to leave. You must now return to body and life in the world on earth, my son, he said. Now go and learn well and remember all of these things at all times, and no longer carry the fear of not being loved. You are loved by all things when you love all things. The hermit watched as his teacher left the room, and for a moment he stood looking into the garden, perplexed by the beauty and colour that shone from every quarter. The hermit opened his eyes and caught the first light of dawn sleeping through the canopy of the high forest over his head, and he looked around for Dogwolf. But he was gone. Remembering the dreams and his meetings with his teacher, he scrambled out of his lean-to and onto the grass, which was still wet from the early morning dew. The sun was starting to creep up into the sky as the moon started to slip down. He looked around for the dog wolf, he whistled, he called, no response. The hermit stood up and began to walk around the forest to see if he could see the dog wolf. There was no sign of him at all. A sense of sadness and loss overcame him as he stared through the trees into the shadows. He turned around and started to walk back to collect the bag and break down his camp. It's always important to leave nature as you find her. Whenever she's cared for you through the night, he remembered the words of his teacher, clean up. As he approached the camp, he stopped in his tracks by the big oak tree. He was there. Dogwolf sat next to the oak tree, which lay on the ground in exactly the same spot where it had been the night before. Only this time, Dogwolf looked different, taller, muscular. There was no dried blood on his body, and where were all the scars? Where were all the wounds? He was absolutely spotless. He did not have one mark on his magnificent body. Dogwolf sat erect, his ears alert, his eyes wide open, blue and golden, shining like two suns. He panted, and the hermit thought that he looked as if he may have been smiling. The hermit dropped onto his haunches and beckoned to the dogwolf with his hands. Not a word was needed. He set off with a bound and leapt 2 meters into the air. He almost turned a somersault and nearly lost balance as he skidded through the bracken. How pleased they were to see each other. But the meeting was different from the one last night. Dogwolf had no fear, and in fact seemed like a totally different animal. They kissed, they played, they rolled on the ground over and over again. For 10 minutes or so, the hermit picked himself up and fell down, dusted himself up, as Dogwolf would knock him down again. The sun was now getting brighter. Dawn was truly here, and the day had begun. It was time for the hermit to continue with his journey. He wondered if Dogwolf could come with him. And actually, he took it for granted that he would. He picked up his bag and threw it over his shoulder. He started to walk away from Dogwolf, who sat looking at him, watching every move, with an alertness superior to anything, his tail wagging from side to side, forcing its way through the bracken which covered his haunches. But as the hermit walked slowly away, Dogwolf did not move a muscle. He sat and he watched. Hermit stopped again, and this time he turned to face Dogwolf. "Are you going to come with me?" He still sat, and he didn't respond. looking straight into the hermit's eyes. "Listen." Hermit dropped onto his knees, looked straight into the dog wolf's eyes, where he sat. "If you want to come with me, you can, you know." He ran his hand through his beard, and suddenly, deep inside his mind, he heard a voice. He heard a name. Dibuk. "So that's your name, Dibuk." He called to Dog Wolf, his tail wagged with even more force, and his eyes seemed to light up, and he barked 3 short, happy little barks before he leapt onto his haunches, turned round, and sprang off into the bracken, leaving the hermit alone. The sun was well into the morning sky, and the heat of the new day started to warm the forest. Hermit felt so humble. He'd rescued an angel, and an angel had rescued him. He would never forget Dibuk, the wolf dog, nor would he forget the lessons that Dibuk had given to him. He could see light and a patch of green in the distance through the trees. The edge of the forest was near. Thank you. That's it from me. Thank you very much for listening to my stories. And I leave you with one final thought, which is to do with Wales. Observing the fractured state of the Welsh kingdom, perhaps the only thing that does unite these islands in which we live are the mighty seas that surround us, and I remain defiant.